Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, when one person's protest movement is a government's, quote, terrorist group.
For now, Palestine Action joins 81 other organisations that are prescribed in the UK, including Hamas, al-Qaeda, and the neo-Nazi group National Action.
What direct action and protesting for Palestine mean now in the UK? I'm Manuel Rapalo, and this is The Take. The UK designated Palestine Action, a pro-Palestinian direct action group, as a terrorist organization. Dozens also supporting Palestine Action have been arrested.
I think it's crazy that our government is trying to enlist them as terrorists. There's people in prison now, some of them that I've met while I was in prison, who are facing terrorist charges in a long time inside, and they're peaceful protesters who are just...
We've tried everything. We've tried the big marches, we've tried the petitions, we've tried lobbying our MPs, and we know that it's not in their interest to stop this. They benefit from it, they support it, and they're not going to just grow a conscience all of a sudden.
Every brick that falls from our base, from our foundation of freedom, is something that's scary, so we're going to fight against it.
To talk us through all of this, we're joined by a writer and activist for Palestine in the UK.
My name's Hill Aked. I'm an author and an organiser based in London, UK.
Hill, welcome to The Take. On Friday, the pro-Palestine activist group Palestine Action was designated as a terrorist organization. What is your response to the UK government's decision to officially prescribe Palestine Action as a terrorist group?
So I think it's worth pointing out that this was an unprecedented step by the British government to prescribe as a terrorist organisation a group which has engaged in a consistent campaign of non-violent direct action, chiefly against sites connected to Elbit Systems, Israel's biggest arms manufacturer. And so when I say non-violent, the group Palestine Action did cause millions of pounds worth of damage to arms companies by smashing up military equipment, but they never harmed or attempted to harm a human being. The British government was able to designate it as a terrorist group anyway, because the definition of terrorism is very broad and it includes serious damage to property. What we're seeing is that many actors, even those who do not support the aims or the tactics of Palestine Action, such as the Times and The Economist, publications like that, but also civil liberties groups such as Amnesty and Liberty here in the UK, have called this a really draconian use or abuse of counterterrorism legislation. It really highlights, to my mind, firstly, the way that the desire to defend Zionism and to defend the military-industrial complex is forcing so-called liberal democracies like the US and Britain to actually abandon key tenets of democracy, such as the right to protest and of liberalism.
There's a lot of really interesting points that you made just there. Let's zoom in on that group a little bit more, Palestine Action, because I think that maybe for a lot of our audience members, this might be the first time that they're hearing about this group in particular. And the reason that it's made so many headlines around the world is because of a protest that took place on Saturday. Tell us about the protest at London's Parliament Square, where more than 24 people were arrested. Walk us through what happened.
Yeah, so the ban came into force here in Britain at midnight on Friday night. And the very next day, between 20 and 30 people kind of affiliated with a campaign group called Defend Our Juries, very openly went to Parliament Square to intentionally break the new law, to engage in, I suppose, an act of civil disobedience, including, I believe, an 83-year-old priest.
I care to stand up for the people of Palestine.
What they did was they held signs up that said, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action. And they actually, I think, wrote to the police in advance to inform them that they would be doing this. Sure enough, they got arrested, and I can only assume they will be charged for terrorism offences, namely, expressing support for a prescribed group. And that carries a sentence, if I'm right, of I think up to 14 years in prison. So what they were hoping to do, as far as I understand it, was to highlight what they see as the absurdity of this new law, which puts a non-violent direct action group in the same category as al-Qaeda and ISIS and neo-Nazi groups like National Action.
Do you feel like you're having to be more careful with what you say about this group ever since this new designation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, it's a scary time for everyone who is in the Palestine movement. It's a time of, reflection and taking stock. But also, I do believe the Palestine Solidarity movement will and is continuing to find ways to continue to support Palestinians in their struggle for liberation. There's no other option.
Mm. And Palestine Action is sort of self-described as a direct action group, right? The Palestine Action has previously been involved in direct actions, including occupying weapons factories. The group has also been accused of vandalizing property linked to arms manufacturing. Mm-hmm. When you hear from critics, they say that these are criminal acts.
Since its inception in 2020, Palestine Action has orchestrated and enacted a campaign of direct criminal action against businesses and institutions, including key national infrastructure and defence firms that provide services and supplies to support Ukraine, NATO, our Five Eyes allies, and the UK defence industry.
How do you see that characterization?
I think that the people who conducted actions with Palestine Action would not dispute and were fully aware that they were breaking the law and would have expected to be facing sort of criminal damage charges. I think their argument was that they were breaking the law in order to prevent a bigger crime, namely the genocide that Israel is perpetrating in Palestine, and that Britain, they feel, is not only failing in its legal duty under the Genocide Convention to prevent and punish acts of genocide, but actually aiding and abetting is what.
Yeah. And Hill, one might argue that one of the more high-profile actions by Palestine Action has been this incident involving the group pouring red spray paint into the turbine engines of two Airbus Voyager aircraft. These are military aircraft that are used for refueling in midair. The UK's Home Secretary described Palestine's activities on the Brize Norton Royal Air Force Base as criminal damage, and said that counterterrorism police are leading an investigation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that incident specifically?
I can't tell you loads more about it, other than, as you said, 4 people broke into the Royal Air Force Base in Oxfordshire on electric scooters. They were carrying Palestinian flags, and they spray painted a couple of RAF planes with red paint to symbolize Palestinian blood. And they did so to symbolize the fact, or to highlight the fact, that RAF planes have been carrying out reconnaissance missions over Gaza in order to pass intelligence to Israel to carry out its genocide. And they've been charged with offences under the Terrorism Act because the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, argued that this represented a threat to national security. And whilst that was the trigger, I think it's important to contextualise this within a longer history of lobbying by Palestine Action's main target, Elbit Systems, and also Israel lobby groups like We Believe in Israel, and no doubt the Israeli embassy as well. A long history of those groups and actors lobbying the British government and the Criminal Prosecution Service here to outlaw Palestine Action.
But there are already laws in place against vandalism, against breaking and entering. But you then, though, believe that to add terrorism into the mix is going too far.
There's a long history of direct action, which I think inspired Palestine Action, including Palestine-focused sort of decommissioning of military sites such as the Raytheon 9 and Smash Edo, but also other sort of foreign policy issues and wars, such as the women who decommissioned Hawk jets that were going to be used by Suharto's regime in Indonesia to bomb East Timor. And also, more recent history in this country, there's been an uptick in direct action around the climate emergency. So one of the founders of Palestine Action, Richard Barnard, was, I think, involved in a group called Extinction Rebellion, who used mass civil disobedience tactics, as other groups have used, such as Just Stop Oil, because they felt that the state was acting far too slowly, and they used direct action for this reason. None of them have been branded terrorists, although there has been, again, this is the broader context, increasing repression of direct action tactics, such as the criminalization of the use of quote-unquote lock-ons. And so this is, I think, and for me, an illustration of the problems with the war on terror as a whole, is that it has been used by states around the world, not just in Britain, to increase state control and to minimize people's freedoms to protest.
More with Hill after the break. So, Hill, one really interesting point here and sort of concerning, you might say, Palestine Action now joins 81 other groups in the UK that are, quote, prescribed under the Terrorism Act of 2000. These groups include ISIL, they include al-Qaeda, Hamas. I think there's at least one neo-Nazi group in the mix there. And some members of parliament and human rights organizations are saying that they're very concerned that this crackdown could be more about suppressing dissent, as you already mentioned, than about public safety.
I love this country and I love our democracy and I want to see it protected. I think today's prescription order against Palestine Action undermines that, and I wish my government wouldn't do it.
Do you see this then as part of a broader sort of trend in the United Kingdom, one that seeks to perhaps change the definition of terrorism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the context of this is also the creeping kind of use of war on terror concepts and laws to infringe upon people's civil liberties. So we have something in the UK called the Prevent Programme, which seeks to, in its own words, kind of spot people and prevent them from becoming terrorists. But what that has meant is state surveillance of Muslim communities, people with any views really, which kind of diverge from a liberal sort of centrist, being branded as extremists, long before anyone has committed any act of violence. And actually, of course, with no evidence that anyone was going to go on months or years later to commit an act of violence. So there's this kind of psychic anxiety in Western governments, which is causing them to abandon the very freedoms that they kind of purport to be defending.
So what's happening now with people who are members of Palestine Action? What are they doing now in response to this new prescription?
Well, firstly, just to make clear, I've written a book about, the repression of Palestine solidarity in Britain and around the world. And I have taken direct action at an Elbit System drone engines factory, kind of as an activist. But that was with a different group many years before Palestine Action was founded. So I don't know what they're doing. What I do know is it's now illegal to be a member of the group. So it's effectively disbanded. Its social media channels have been wiped. And what I can say is that I know, because Huda Amori, who was one of the co-founders of the group, announced on a public Zoom call that she will be challenging the prescription through the courts. And before they were prescribed, when they were still legally able to sort of fundraise, the group raised something like £100,000 24 hours towards the legal case to challenge the prescription. As I said, many people who do not necessarily support Palestine Action's aims or tactics still believe that the prescription was draconian and set a worrying precedent and should be challenged in the courts.
So, Hill, for people protesting in support of Palestine, is there a difference, legally or in practice, between holding a Palestinian flag and holding a sign that says, "I support Palestine Action"? For people who are going to potentially continue to protest against Israel's war on Gaza, how worried should they be about that?
So, I mean, Palestine Action is a group in the movement. Was founded in 2020, so it's very, very distinct from the entirety Palestinian liberation struggle and the solidarity movement. So people should absolutely not feel intimidated and cowed and continue to express their support for Palestine and Palestinians. That said, what we are seeing already is the police in this country trying to either, intentionally or unwittingly or whatever, repress and intimidate people from expressing any support for Palestine. I've heard reports already of people being told to take off T-shirts that just say, I support Palestine. Merely the word Palestine being told, well, you could be in breach of this prescription. And I think actually that was probably part of what the state and the Zionists have been pushing for this, and the Israeli government were hoping. It is an attempt to intimidate and repress and pacify the entirety of the solidarity movement. And it's very important that we don't let that happen whilst being informed about our rights, so that we know the law and we can make informed decisions about what we choose to say and not say.
Ney, these are your opinions that you're sharing with us today, not necessarily the stance of Al Jazeera. But I'm wondering if you can talk about an op-ed that you wrote for Al Jazeera, where you say that essentially actions taken by the Palestine Solidarity Movement should not be considered terrorism. Israel should be. I'm paraphrasing, but can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah, firstly, that was written before the ban came into force, so I won't comment on the Palestine Action part of that, to be honest. But I think, I very much stand by the fact that, what we're really facing here, the real issue is state terrorism by Israel, which has killed or maimed 200,000 people, has displaced millions of people. They're rounding Palestinians up into what is literally a concentration camp, and they're calling it humanitarian city. Meanwhile, the British government continues to send F-35 components and to fly reconnaissance flights over Gaza. So I'm keen to not let the prescription of Palestine Action completely derail us into arguments about free speech. It is a good example of how Palestinian freedom and all of our freedoms are intertwined and are being eroded to defend the Zionist project. But we must keep the focus, I think, on Palestine, on Britain's material support for Israeli state terrorism. And we mustn't let anything stop the movement until Palestine is free.
And Hill, I'm curious if this decision by the UK to designate Palestine Action as a terrorist organization, the fact that being a member or even showing support could carry a penalty of up to 14 years in prison. We've said that already. Has this changed how you think, maybe philosophically, about protests?
Well, I think what I will say is that I have always believed, and I continue to believe, that social movements are what changes the world. Social movements are the engines of history. And I believe that social movements need and use a wide variety of strategies and tactics. There's this saying that there's no one way. It takes all of us shoving at something to bring it down. Although this one group has been banned, I don't think the government can ban tactics such as direct action, though it does remain to be seen whether they will try to prosecute any new groups or other groups, or they might try to claim that such groups are just Palestine Action. But yeah, as I said, I think what the state and the Zionist movement are trying to do is to drive a wedge between different wings of the Palestine movement and to intimidate and pacify it. And, Hassan Kanafani said that everything in the world can be stolen or robbed, and I would add, everything in the world can be banned except the love that emanates from a human being towards solid commitment to a conviction or cause, right? So they can't ban an entire movement. And the repression that we're seeing since about 2010, really, and it's a worldwide phenomenon, is an illustration of the fact that Palestinians have won the moral argument. The entire world supports them, and the repression from Israel, but also states like Britain, the US, and Germany, it may get worse still before it gets better, and we should be prepared for that. But I don't think they can keep a lid on this forever. And I believe that one day the dam is going to burst completely.
Hill Aked, thank you so much for joining us today on The Take.
Thank you.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all our recent content updated regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. See you tomorrow.